Thanks, Mark, and great to see you all this morning. I'm trapped behind a microphone. I have to move, so I'll be good and stand still. Obviously, the theme of today is the confused and confusing nature of Reconstruction in Arkansas, and that story of confused and confusing goes also for electoral politics during this period. And it contrasts, I think, with a much simpler story of the Reconstruction era of Arkansas that's often been advanced and continues in some ways to be advanced today. The simpler version of the story of partisan politics during Reconstruction is that this was a period of absolute Republican dominance. And we often hear in portrayals or descriptions of modern day electoral politics that whenever something happens in which Republicans have some success, it is often described as for the first time since Reconstruction. That is kind of one of those things that is often built in. And it is a phrase often used to describe a unique period when Republicans did certainly win most elections in Arkansas. And thus the title of this talk is an exceptional moment, because it really does focus on a period of distinctive Republican success, as Carl alluded to. And indeed, comparatively, before what became before it, of course, where Republicans did not exist in the state, and what comes for 100 plus years later, it was a good period electorally for Republicans. But it was also a fleeting moment, lasting less than 8 years from a most generous description. And while it is true that the Republican Party had distinctive success during the height of the Reconstruction period, Republican dominance, I would argue, has been overstated a bit, and it's a lot more complicated than simple Republican dominance. The constant changes in the makeup of the electorate, the dynamics of state-federal relationships during this period, which often reshape who is in the electorate and what the rules of the political game are, and ever-shifting party labels during this period come together to create a very messy story that is difficult to analyze in any systematic way. And so while I appreciate being the lone political scientist included in this group of historians, I've been denied a lot of the tools that I use. There are almost no electoral records of elections. The records that exist are maybe a little questionable. The party labels are switching nonstop, and so it gets hard to do any analysis from election to election. There are tons of elections, nonstop elections, during this period, and so it is. In many ways, I'm lost in this 8-year period, but I hopefully have a few things to say. I think that while I describe this as an exceptional moment, and I think it is appropriate because of the Republican dominance during this period to do so, I think it misses a reality that is anything but exceptional in Arkansas politics, really from the start of this, from statehood until today. And that is that ongoing factionalism within the majority party, whether that is the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, is really the constant story throughout. And one of the reasons this is such a messy period is because that this was really, in Arkansas politics, a lot more about factionalism than anything else. And thus, Republican dominance in any single-voiced way is really much too simplistic. The one thing that was constant during this period, as I suggested, is the frequency of elections. And folks complain about frequent elections today. They weren't living in the 1860s and 1870s when there are constant elections in the state, understandably. There are major statewide elections almost every year, often more than one. During the Reconstruction period in Arkansas, that I kind of, from an electoral perspective, bookend as existing between March of 1864, when there is the first constitutional the ratification of the Constitution of 1864, and then the October 1874 ratification election that, of course, changes the Constitution to our current election. And so that 10-year period, really the bookends of this period. Now, making any systematic analysis more difficult, as I said, is that this electorate is constantly changing. What am I doing? Ideas? No, I hit it.
Checking that it's on or off. Is it green on the side?
I don't know. It's green. Oh, what do I do? I do that? All right. I'm going to go the sort of old-fashioned way and hit the button, but it's a fancy button. We start, of course, with the 1864 constitutional ratification vote. And I think unquestionably, as Carl suggested, that 1864 Constitution was ratified by a deeply non-representative electorate. The Confederacy, of course, still controlled the southern portion, southwestern portion of Arkansas, and the 1864 Constitution was ratified by a very small percentage of folks living in the northern part of the state. The state legislature immediately passed a new loyalty oath for voters that required a voter to swear that they'd not supported the Confederacy since March of 1864. That reduced turnout votes even more. This so-called, there were about 6,500 votes cast in the state in the congressional races in 1865. And that was, of course, a very shrunken electorate, and certainly an electorate that was very different than electorates that had preceded it. Now, this so-called Ironclad Oath, this sharp limitation on the electorate, was eventually struck down in late 1865 in this Supreme Court case of Risen et al. Versus Farr. And the argument was in the Risen case was that the law, the Ironclad Oath, had in essence added to the constitutional requirement about who could vote an additional criteria for becoming a voter. And interestingly, when Arkansas considered its most recent voter ID law a couple years ago, this old Supreme Court case popped back up as good precedent, adding to the state constitution a new requirement. And thus, it's one reason that Arkansas next year is going to be voting on a constitutional amendment that will further alter the requirement about who can be a voter in the state with a voter ID. And this Supreme Court case in late 1865 is a complete game changer in terms of who gets to vote in the elections of 1866. Is that this really opens the doors again to conservative power at the ballot box, and as was suggested by Carl, it sweeps into office in 1866 many of the elites, indeed many of the soldiers who had been in power before the war, and really it is a complete dominance of conservatives in the state and local elections of 1866. Really, the only folks remaining on the stage who were Republicans were Governor Isaac Murphy and the State Secretary of State, and they were not up until 1868. And I think all roads were leading to a complete elimination of Republicans, very swift elimination of Republicans in Arkansas. And immediately, as these conservatives come into office in 1866, they use their political power to pass law after law after law that really favors the social elites, thus white men in particular, and the economic elites. And this was just a flurry of legislation in this period. The rejection of the 14th Amendment, though, by this legislature is obviously the game changer that as it happens across the the region, really that leads to the radicalization of federal policy towards the South in this so-called congressional Reconstruction period. Now, in Arkansas, that meant reinstatement of the Ironclad Oath via both federal law, which gave military officials in the 4th Military District a tremendous amount of power. And the leader of the charges in that regard, and the guy who made the calls during that period, is General EOC Ord, who was the leader of the 4th Military District. He had the power to determine who could participate in an election, and also driven by Ord to determine whether to truly overhaul the state constitution. And in November of 1867, 41,000 voters participated, with 2/3 of them supporting a constitutional convention. And that convention in 1865 was indeed dominated by radical Republicans and was a decidedly biracial convention with about 12% of the participants African American. And so the so-called black and tan conventions that you hear about throughout the South, the 1868 convention, Constitutional Convention in Arkansas, was just that. The Constitution of 1868 was written very swiftly, and it expanded gubernatorial powers significantly. As Carl said, it established the first public school system, although it was an explicitly segregated school system. It redistricted the state legislature dramatically in a way that favored the Delta and Southwest Arkansas, thus maximizing Republican enclaves in the state legislature. It denied the vote to those who had been disloyal or had, quote, violated the rules of civilized warfare during the war. And the vote on ratifying the new Constitution was rushed to voters in mid-March of 1868, along with the congressional and state elections of that year. The Constitution was easily ratified, and Republicans were elected with only token opposition. And most importantly, Powell Clayton was elected governor at that time. That sets the stage for the election of November of 1868, the presidential election of November of 1868. That election, in the lead up to that election, over 20,000 new African American voters were added to the rolls. And I know Blake is going to discuss Black African American empowerment more generally, especially in terms of elective office, but this is obviously an important period in terms of African Americans really coming into the electorate in a new way. But this lead up to 1868 is also important because it is a period of distinct political violence in the lead up to that election in November of 1868. And Ken is going to talk about that, and then Governor Clayton's response to it, which many would argue was quite assertive in putting down, or at least limiting, the impact of the Ku Klux Klan and other political violence in Arkansas. Now, what's interesting about the election of 1868, several things. First off, the electorate does shrink compared to the election of 1860, the election before the Civil War, which obviously was a very competitive election. Obviously, Arkansas not a state for purposes of the presidential election of 1864. 1868, we do see some shrinkage in the electorate. We also, of course, see a change in the winner. The Southern Democrat Breckinridge had won 54% in 1860. 1868, Ulysses S. Grant wins just under 54%. I think it's important to note that this is, I think, what is often portrayed as absolute Republican dominance. That's really not the story, is that there is a healthy 46% of the electorate at the mass level still very dedicated to democracy with a capital D in this shrunken electorate. And I think it's also important to note just how conservative this 1868 Democratic National Party was. This is language from the 1868 Democratic National Committee platform, and you can see it is a platform deeply dedicated to bringing the South back in the fold as quickly as possible, giving amnesty to all who had been a part of the Confederacy, and giving those men back the franchise. And as we see down below, really saying that this party is committed to bringing conservatives back into the fold, forgetting all past differences of opinion. Okay, a euphemism for a civil war. Okay, and I think what's interesting here is that this very thoroughly National Democratic Party does get 46% of the vote in this election. This is suggesting that this was a pretty always the Republican control during this period, as real as it was in terms of who controlled elections, who set the rules of the game for election, who counted the votes at election. It's always, I think, important to note that this was a more tenuous control, especially at the mass level, than has been portrayed. And I think we're going to hear a little bit about how much violence may have kind of contributed to that tenuousness. But this thing was not ready for the long haul, I think, in many ways during this period. Now, what's also interesting is where the votes are in this period. This is the election of 1868. Obviously, the Democrat, the former governor of New York, Seymour. These are the counties where Seymour runs particularly well. And the shading, obviously, the darker the shading, the most Democratic of the vote. Over here, U.S. Grant's strength, and we see his strength, of course, in the traditional Republican foothold of Northwest Arkansas, and we also see it, of course, in the Delta counties and up through Pulaski County. Obviously, the county shapes are different. I think we all know that there are a lot of redrawing of counties during this period, but these are the counties at that point in time. And we see African American electorate, especially in the Delta, a little bit in Southwest Arkansas, and then, of course, Republicanism in Northwest Arkansas. And so I think it's always important to think about the regional patterns that we see at this period as well. Now, the other, I think, very important thing to note, and something that is one of those things that is incredibly frustrating for political scientists, is just how malleable party labels are during this period. And this makes, I think, writing this history, super complicated. In my world, it's Democrats, Republicans with, the occasional Ross Perot thrown in for fun. This is much more complicated than that. Democrats, especially in the immediate aftermath of the 1864 elections, really avoided using that term oftentimes. The term that was more often used was conservatives with a capital C, that in essence meant pre-war Democrats and pre-war Whigs who were combined together, but it's a little complicated in that respect. We also see, as time goes on, though, a real rise of factionalism within the dominant, but perhaps not as overwhelmingly dominant as some suggest, Republican Party. And soon after Powell Clayton becomes governor, we start to see factionalism really break out within the Republican Party between Clayton's regular Republicans and the liberals, who later become, of course, known as Brindle Tails. I think it's important as we think about this kind of factionalism of this era. It's pretty non-ideological factionalism. It is, I think it's more about personality. It's a factionalism more based on personality. There were moving pieces during this era in terms of factionalism. And it, I think, contrasted dramatically with the very real ideological factionalism that we see oftentimes in D.C. during this period, the factional division between radical Republicans and mainliners. In terms of partisanship, the election of 1872, of course, was really the high point for factionalism. And that's going to grow over the years, over the couple of years following into the Brooks-Baxter War that Tom's going to discuss later, which is truly the most confused and confusing event in the state's history. A few years ago, I did an earlier incarnation of a panel like this, and I was assigned the Brooks-Baxter War, which I considered a hazing episode for a political scientist. It's the most confusing thing to describe. So stay around for the afternoon session as Tom describes that. And there, of course, we see the regular Republicans of Baxter versus the brindle tails of Brooks really play out in that battle. After Baxter wins that close election at the ballot box, in his 1873 address, inaugural address, he promises to lead a period of peace and good feeling in the state. And the most important act that he takes in leading us to peace and good feeling is the March 1873 amendment to the Constitution that removed limitations on former Confederates. And Arkansas was actually the last southern state to take such action. Of course, that is not a period of peace and good feeling. It is instead a period that becomes known as warfare on the streets outside of this building. The ongoing Republican division, and I think it's fair to say Arkansans' frustration with the chaos that is exemplified by the Brooks-Baxter conflict really set the stage for the end of Reconstruction in Arkansas with the ratification of the Constitution of 1874. And I think it is super important how those events and the chaos around those events and the desire on the part of Arkansans, many political stripes, to end that chaos, as this telegraphed to President Grant from the Lee County Sheriff said, "We do not care, and I speak the sentiments of the people of Arkansas without egotism. Who is governor? All we want is peace." And I think that really, that desire for peace, no matter what the new rules of the game were, in many ways sets the stage for a constitution of 1874 that I know Rodney's going to talk about in more detail later in the day, that really creates a very different kind of constitutional democracy. And in political science, kind of a new field that has established itself within the broader subject of political science that, of course, steals from every discipline imaginable. One of these key kind of threads of research in recent years becomes known as American political development, that there are these kind of magic moments in American constitutional development and institutional development that really are important for everything that comes after. And in particular, when key institutions are created at a magic moment, such as a constitution, that can really have crucial impact on all that follows. And the Constitution of 1874, which is created in the aftermath of the Brooks-Baxter War, and that totally reshapes the expectations about government, limits dramatically the power of government in general, and in particular the power of the governor, and really puts all kinds of sharp limitations on how government spends its money, and whether government can take on debt really creates a spirit in which Arkansans expect very little of their government for the decades that follow. And I think that in many ways, this key institution, the Constitution of 1874, really grew into a culture of low expectations about government in Arkansas. And so I do think that this is a particular key moment, not just that Reconstruction ended, but how it ended in Arkansas. I think a very important period, because, of course, institutions have continued to shape this culture with all kinds of other changes over time. Of course, the Futural Amendments that further sharpened the limitations on government's taxing power in the 1930s, in the heart of the Depression, meaning that we are a constitution that has a real bias towards certain taxes, such as the sales tax, rather than more widespread taxes. Our continued rejection of constitutional reform, a wholesale constitutional reform, wanting to hold on to the kind of the core tenets of the Constitution of 1874, and then I think an inherent distrust of elite power that really persists in Arkansas. And I think a lot of that does go back to the Constitution of 1874 and the way in which the Brooks-Baxter conflict ended. Now, of course, unquestionably, Democrats come back into power. And we start to see increases in the electorate as for a window of a couple of decades, there really is relatively little disenfranchisement, either of whites or of African Americans, except for women, of course. And we see the growth of an electorate, and in 1876, an easy win for the Democrat Samuel Tilden in that very conflicted election of 1876. And the regional map in Arkansas starts to look very different, decidedly polarized, but throughout most of the state, outside of the Delta and up to the state capital, with a handful of Ozark counties, this is now a decidedly Democratic state, and that, of course, becomes the map that really drives the state for the future. Now, I think that what's important, and of course, these changes that we see here at the presidential level, of course, also show themselves in state politics. And of course, Augustus Garland becomes the first Democratic governor after this period, and we start to then move into a period of Democratic factionalism for the decade that follows. But the Redeemers are back in power. Now, my key takeaways are that this whole story is much more complicated than has historically been the case, especially at the mass level. It's a very brief window in Arkansas history electorally in which Republicans do have some power. All during that period, there is dramatic and important and significant factionalism within the Republican Party. So it's a lot more complicated, it's a lot more messy, it's a lot more confusing. But it was important for conservative Democrats who get back into power to keep the story as simple as possible. And we see the closing lines from Thomas Staples' Reconstruction in Arkansas, 1862 to 1874. Obviously, Thomas Staples, the Arkansas expression of the Dunning School. The Dunning School, of course, from Columbia, which for decades told the story of Reconstruction in a way very different from the way that Carl told it earlier. And this is the closing sentence from his book. Reconstruction and its first fruits were now in the past, and it was not yet revealed how long the people of Arkansas were to suffer from the years of Republican rule through which they had passed. And I think this notion that this was absolute Republican dominance that completely obliterated the voice of Arkansans, I think was an important part of the way in which Reconstruction, and especially the politics of Reconstruction, were portrayed later, because I think it was used as a crucial tool for Democrats whenever they needed to rile up the electorate, to remind the electorate of why they were Democrats. And we see this, of course, most emphatically during the era of disenfranchisement, including the key legislation passed in the early 1890s that really, truly did limit the vote of African Americans and poor whites. We see it as the go-to card in political rhetoric of the early years of the 20th century. Jeff Davis being the kind of great example of playing the Reconstruction card whenever a back was against the wall politically. We see it in the school textbooks of the period, including John Hugh Reynolds' Story of Arkansas, which was written, of course, published before Thomas Starling Staples. But the textbooks that many of the folks in this room, when they were in Arkansas history classes, as they learned about Reconstruction, it was a Reconstruction that was much more in the spirit of the Dunning School. And thus, Reconstruction electorally gets portrayed in a very simple, simplistic, Republicans-dominated, abused power way. And I think in many ways that continues to linger with us today. Although we have a much more complex understanding of this confused and confusing time, I think we continue to be cynical about government having too much power in many ways because of this mantra about the Reconstruction era electorally that has historically been portrayed. And so that's what I have to say, but I'd be glad to answer a few questions.
I always read at the election of 1872, you show there, Arkansas's votes went to Grant, but the opponents about to saying they were thrown out on a technicality.
Yeah, this thing, part of this driving a political scientist crazy. Yeah, I mean, that was, you can't get much in the way of returns. I mean, the map, and most of the technicality, I was trying to find my 1868 map. If you look at the map from 1872, you see a lot of counties, I believe I can't remember how many counties where you just have no returns from those counties. And so we really don't even know exactly what the votes were in that election. We do have, kind of this, sorry, I have enough problems with technology, but there we go. This is I think now it's working. We got too little technology and too much technology simultaneously. This I think is a guesstimate in terms of turnout. We are starting to see some increase, but we do have counties where we have no records at all. We have other counties where things were thrown out even after the fact. And I think that I do think it's important to make this distinction between kind of elite republicanism, and Republicans had tremendous power in terms of who ran elections, who counted votes, who did all that, who decided when votes needed to be discarded, and then what we know about the mass level, which suggests a much more closely divided state.
What was the technicality?
I think it was just a question about whether the improprieties in a subset of counties, but others of y'all who are actually historians may know more about this. I don't know.
There were 14 counties.
There's the 14.
Completely thrown out.
Yeah, and it's 14
By
counties.
governor, by compilation.
Yeah. And so if you look at the map of the election of 1872, you've got a lot of gray spaces where there are no returns. And it is 14. They're mostly northeastern, as I remember, they're mostly northeastern counties with maybe a spotting here and there elsewhere in the state. But yeah, that was so the governor really did, I think, arguably, as Democrats would later say, abuse the power during that period.
To get that 52%.
Right, to win a vote. Yeah. Other questions?
When does the Delta,
Yep, go ahead.
when does the Delta start going back Democratic? Is that after 1900?
No, it's really after 1891. I mean, when you have you have the dramatic election reforms of the early 1890s that really do eliminate African American for the vote during that period, and you just see these just dramatic decreases in electoral participation in the Delta counties, and in particular, you see dramatic decreases from African Americans in terms of participation, especially in the Delta. Now, it gets complicated because of the poll tax and the way in which some white elites continue to use African Americans as a source for extra political power by buying poll taxes and then voting those African Americans, without African Americans having autonomy over who they voted for. So that is a part of the story as well. And so I think, all of Arkansas's history is a little more complex when it comes to elections because of some of those shenanigans and abuses across time. But we see the dramatic decrease in the 1890s. Yes?
When did the Redeemers begin to gain a political majority?
It's really right there, right? It's really in 1874. And then with the election of Garland, that really is the game changer. And from that moment until 1966, that is complete Democratic dominance. Now, Democratic factionalism that does, I think, continue the tradition of factionalism that we see during this period. And I think it's important to note for folks of early Arkansas history, obviously there was factionalism in the earliest days of Arkansas as well. That is, I think it is factionalized politics within a dominant party that really is the thread throughout history. And I would argue that there are hints of that same kind of factionalism within the dominant Republican Party in Arkansas now. I think there are some divisions there. And I think that in the future, we may look back and see some of those more sharply now, but I think that many would argue in the last legislative session, we start to see some of that factionalism arising. We have seen almost no moments of true two-party Arkansas politics at the state level, with the possible exception of the decade or so that we just went through during the BB era, the late Huckabee and BB era. I think that's really the only period where we can really look at Arkansas history and say we had a true two-party system, a vibrant two-party system at the mass level, in the legislature, et cetera. We really see factionalism for whichever party's in control through most of this period, the Republicans, but and today the Republicans, but through most of our state's history, really the Democrats.
So when did the loyalty oath begin to influence the way the Redeemers came back?
This is really, 1873, really the change in the, Governor Baxter's kind of attempt to get through the crisis of that contested election of 1872. He immediately puts in place this liberation of the vote, and that constitutional amendment is quickly voted on by the people, and the Redeemers really flow back into power in 1873, and that obviously sets the stage for the constitutional amendment, constitutional convention, and then the Constitution itself in 1874. So I think that's really the crucial moment as Baxter tries to make peace. It obviously doesn't work, as we see, and as Tom will talk about later, but it does certainly give the green light to Redeemers really reclaiming power. And after 1874, you really have we're almost immediately at 90% of legislative seats in both houses held by Democrats, who are proud to use that party label at that time. All right, thanks for having me.